Coming to you from Southern California, this is Mindset, mental health news and information. I'm your host, James Curtis, and I'm joined by one of my favorite people, psychologist, author, television contributor, individual extraordinaire, Dr. Robbie Ludwig. Robbie, you got me?
I do. I'll take extraordinary.
Okay.
That works for me, too. I'll take that.
Oh, fantastic. Robbie is joining me from New York. She is a licensed therapist, a psychologist, and does a whole lot more. And on today's show, we're going to be talking about a topic that has been in the news a lot, and it starts with this gentleman.
The science of sexual assault prevention has evolved to the point where we have a good understanding of how to help men change and how to help men, stand up and take responsibility for the problem. And now we need more people to do science-based prevention and to implement proven and effective programs.
That is the voice that I just cut off of Alan Berkowitz. He is a PhD psychologist and researcher, and he's talking about, as was probably evident, preventing on college campus sexual assaults with an approach that he calls ByStander intervention. And Dr. Robbie Ludwig has done research in the area of campus sexual assaults, and that is our topic for today, preventing, stopping them, and the dynamic, stopping that dynamic that seems to be all but out of control on many of our college campuses. But first, this news from our newly minted online newspaper, The Mindset Report. The Mindset Report available at online, mindsetreport.com. The Mindset Report, your most comprehensive online source for mental health news. Today's Mindset Report is underwritten by Responsibility, a complete guide to bystander intervention by Alan Berkowitz. He's going to be our guest today, along with Dr. Robbie Ludwig. Alan Berkowitz is committed to the idea that the solution to health and social justice problems requires that we engage as bystanders. From the New York Times, the Senate on Tuesday unanimously passed the Clay Hunt bill. The bill, named for the Iraq veteran Marine, aims to improve suicide prevention and mental health treatment programs at the Department of Veteran Affairs. The bill also passed the House unanimously and now goes to the White House, where President Obama is expected to sign it. According to the latest governmental data, an estimated 22 veterans kill themselves every day. Now, while many are older veterans, a survey by the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, which made the Clay Hunt bill a centerpiece of their effort to prevent these veteran suicides, found that 2 out of every 5 of its members knew a recent combat veteran who had committed suicide. And directly from its debut at the Sundance Film Festival, the movie The Hunting Ground is described as a piercing, monumental expose of rape culture on campuses. According to the New York Times Review, the film takes on the fraternity system, in particular Sigma Alpha Epsilon, and even challenges the National Football League teams to avoid one of its top prospects, Jameis Winston. The Florida State University quarterback and Heisman Trophy winner was accused in 2012 of sexual assault by a female student. However, he did not face criminal charges and was cleared of violating Florida State's Student Code of Conduct. And finally, from Psychology Today, a paper in the February 2014 issue of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology finds that a partial confession may actually be worse than a full confession or not confessing at all. In a study where participants were set up to cheat, that must have been fun, not realizing that they were being observed, those who gave partial confessions after they were busted actually had the highest levels of negative feeling, greater than either of those groups of the ones who cheated and did not confess, or the ones who cheated and gave full confessions. For more on these and other mental health stories, visit The Mindset Report at mindsetreport.com. We're back in 60 seconds with our main topic, stopping campus sexual assault, bystander intervention in 60 seconds. Stay with us. Mental health news and information. I'm your host, James Curtis, along with my co-host, individual extraordinaire. That's your official title, Robbie Ludwig, individual extraordinaire. She is a psychotherapist. She's an author. She does television appearances. She's working on so many projects. What aren't you doing, Robbie? That might be the easiest thing to describe.
I'm not cleaning my closets, which is something I should be doing, but can't seem to get myself to do with everything else I'm doing.
Well,
so, truth be told, my closets are not clean.
Some things must indeed fall by the wayside. You can find and follow us on the web, Mindset Mental Health News and Information at mindsetshow.com. Follow us on our Facebook page. Everything that we talk about today, Dr. Robbie Ludwig's link, her website, all the fabulous stuff that she's doing, Dr. Alan Berkowitz, and all of the references that we make today. You can find them on our Facebook page at Mindset Show page on the Facebook site, or our Twitter handle at Mindset Show. Again, my co-host today discussing I don't know, what do we call this, Robbie? Is it an epidemic? Is that too strong? It just seems that it's so pervasive, this idea of campus sexual assault prevention and intervention. I'm glad that you're joining me, Robbie Ludwig, because of your background in psychology, and we're going to go through and discuss my interview with Dr. Alan Berkowitz, one of the foremost experts on bystander intervention. But before we get into that, what do you make of this? And talk to us a little bit about your research and some of the things that you found.
Well, I've been doing a lot of work with Nightline because there have been cases in the news where, it gained a lot of attention. There were gang rapes going on, and specifically the Vanderbilt case where a woman was given a date rape drug. So she was actually raped by one person she had been dating briefly, and was unconscious during the event. And the next day she woke up and was feeling very sick and nauseous and had some physical pains and bruising, but had no recollection of what happened. And it was only after the fact when pictures started to emerge and the story got discussed that she heard after the fact that she had been a victim of gang rape. So we keep hearing these stories more and more, and the thinking is, and what's so scary is that there are some statistics out there that suggest women are more in danger of being raped if they go to college than if they don't.
Wow.
Think about that for a moment.
Wow, that is amazing.
That is a frightening idea.
Yes.
And that kids who are actually committing some of these crimes you couldn't predict it. So there was nothing particularly different about them in any way, given their background, prior to them entering into these college type of scenarios. So the thinking is that there's something going on in these frat houses that's encouraging a kind of groupthink mentality, that is encouraging this kind of behavior and it not being considered what it is, which is a horrible, heinous crime.
That's really absolutely amazing. And on that note, let's jump into my interview with Alan Berkowitz, because one of the questions that I put to him, Dr. Robbie Ludwig, is right in line with that observation that you've made. That is, what is going on with guys, with men, and what, if any, could be the explanation for that dynamic? Here's what he had to say. Can you talk a little bit about why we are men the way we are with respect to our views toward women that translate in worst case scenarios to assaultive behavior?
Sure. Well, first of all, as we know, we all grow up in an environment that trains us to be in certain ways. So as soon as a child is born, there's a certain set of expectations or ideas of what it means to be a girl or what it means to be a boy. And we know that in American society, the expectations for a boy are, for instance, that he be tough, that he not act like a girl, that he be very competitive, that he be a winner. So there's like a code that's established very early on. And even though it may differ across cultures and groups, there's some similar themes. And one of the things that boys are taught is that a man is masculine, however we define that, and not feminine. And one of the characteristics of a successful man is to be sexually successful with women, or to have a lot of conquests, or to have a lot of experiences. And the good news is that we know that most men don't buy into all of this. The research shows that if you take traditional male attributes, such as a man shouldn't cry, most men don't agree with that. Or that a man should have sex even indiscriminately or without permission. Most men don't agree with that. So the good news is that we could have a healthy masculinity in which men act, quote unquote, masculine in appropriate situations. Like we would want men and women in our armed forces to demonstrate traditional male qualities, but that men are not rigidly bound by that, or they're not trapped in that, and that most men don't agree with it. Most men don't agree with the code or the guidelines. So that's the good news. The bad news is that most men don't know that most don't agree with it. Men don't agree with it. So, for instance, I might go to a movie and I'd be very emotional and I feel like crying. But if I think my friends think that's not okay, or that's, wimpy, or whatever word they use, then I'll stifle my impulse to express my emotions. When you talk about an issue like sexual assault, the men in general who are problematic, who are the vast majority, take all these male messages very seriously, and they feel they have to prove their masculinity. And one way they can prove their masculinity or get esteem from other men or be respected by other men is to have a lot of sex with women. So those men we call hyper-masculine. And even though every man, to a certain degree, is taught to not completely respect women, other men take it to the point where they have hostility towards women. Even in a conversation between a male and a female, everyday conversation, the majority of interruptions are the male interrupting the female. So we all participate to a certain extent in attitudes that allow us to, let's say, take center stage.
So that indeed, Robbie Ludwig, is the backdrop, if you will, for this dynamic. And does any of that come as a surprise to you as both a practitioner and in your research?
Well, no, but I don't think it really explains what's going on either. Because, 10 or 20 years ago, I'm not saying that a rape didn't ever happen or that a gang rape didn't ever take place, but it seems to be a bit more commonplace. And so one needs to ask the question, why now? Why is this happening more now? And what's really scary is that the men who are committing this crime don't see themselves as rapists. In fact, they just don't, they would not define themselves that way. They don't experience themselves that way. So they get caught up in a kind of caveman mentality where they're proving their masculinity, and the woman is experienced as like a whole, just an object that has no feelings. And I have to ask the question, you know, is this something related to technology and kids being raised in a technological era? Not exclusively, of course.
Okay, let me just pause
there are
you.
multiple determinants
Sure.
as to, you know, why certain things exist, you know, at a certain cultural moment in time. But are these kids overstimulated by porn before they're ready to really understand what they're taking in? You know, are they just so entitled? Do they not know how to really relate to another person? So that if they are, you know, engaged in this kind of act and they don't get consent, do they not get, you're not supposed to do that unless somebody says yes?
Right. Well, but Robbie Ludwig, and let me, before we jump back into Alan Berkowitz, and if you're just joining us, you're listening to Mindset, Mental Health News and Information. My fabulous co-host, Dr. Robbie Ludwig, out of New York. I'm on the opposite coast in Southern California, and we're talking about the idea of sexual assault, campus sexual assaults, what explains the phenomena, and indeed what might be some of the answers. And along that line, Robbie Ludwig, the idea of the internet, I've talked to a lot of mental health professionals about various issues having to do with social media and today's youth. None of them are willing to attribute any of the negative conduct that we might see in today's society to internet, to social media per se. However, could it be that the idea of isolation, whether it be because of social media or you're sitting at home playing marbles all the time and you just don't socialize with folks the way to, and the danger of sounding like, you know, I'm talking about the quote good old days, in a way that generations in the past growing up, the socialization during your formative adolescent high school years was just more?
Well, listen, you can't, as I said, you can't just blame one aspect of the culture. So you can't just say, oh, it's, you know, just social media. No. But, you know, are we raising kids that don't have interpersonal skills that help them translate morality into certain situations? Are they just used to getting what they want, and so they make that happen and think that that's okay? You know, I'll tell you, the social media has certainly helped to catch some of these rapists who deny and try to delete pictures. You know, the evidence is being captured. So they're taking pictures. There's a sense of pride of what's going on.
Sure,
they want to share it. You know, you have to consider that's a component. And we were just talking the other day about our experience when we were in college.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was at those parties. You know, I was at the parties where people were in a questionable state. And the men that I knew who could have been considered the bad boys or could have been considered the partiers would never do that. There was a boundary set in place, a sense of right and wrong that just wasn't crossed.
Right. And I think... Go ahead.
And so I think there's a gross immaturity and a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding that, you know, combined with what they described in these frat houses as a hyper-masculinity and a groupthink. So what happens in a groupthink is you assess a situation in part based on how other people are assessing it. And if everybody is engaged in the same thing and making it okay and encouraging it, then your ability to think as an individual is diminished. And so these are all components that are contributing. That on top of college campuses turning a blind eye to what's been going on, so that if they don't address it, if it doesn't get addressed in a very public way, then maybe they don't have to deal with it. It'll go away.
Absolutely.
It's like putting their head in the sand.
And what it reminds me of is a conversation I had with my guest last week regarding social emotional IQ, and it really ties directly in. And he actually made that analogy to exactly what you're talking about, being raised in a way that in an atmosphere. And this is not a dig on parents. This is not a dig on anything in particular other than what he calls social emotional IQ, which the program that he researched deals with really instilling that in the curriculum in elementary school, in middle school, to address exactly what you're talking about. Let's go back in, Robbie, and listen to a bit more of Professor Berkowitz as he takes this issue with respect to his assessment of the dynamic, the male dynamic, if you will, and talks about a program along the line or that deals with this by way of bystander intervention.
When women are involved.
Okay.
When we talk about preventing sexual assault, if the majority of men who are respectful of women and would not take advantage of women, and if the majority of men don't enjoy listening to details of men's sexual exploits or talking about women's bodies, then the key to effective prevention would be for the majority to speak up against the minority who do these things, and that's what we call bystander intervention, or we call being an active bystander. When you see something that concerns you, you feel comfortable doing something, and you have a range of things that you could do, including using distraction or using humor or changing the subject. So if I was bragging about sexual experiences and you didn't feel comfortable listening to me, you could just change the subject, or you could distract me. Or if you were in a bar and you saw me taking advantage of a woman and getting her really drunk, you could come over and tell me that LAPD was towing my car. So when we teach people a range of ways to express their discomfort, and when we teach people that other people also feel uncomfortable, then they'll do something. And that's what is the critical ingredients of these successful workshops that we're talking about today, is letting the majority of men know that they're not alone and that other men feel the way they do, and teaching them skills to intervene with the minority who are problematic. I might also add that even though sexual assault is unique as a societal problem, if we look at other health problems like alcohol abuse, or we look at other social justice issues like racism or homophobia, etc., what I'm saying would apply to those other situations as well. If I was with a group of white people and someone made a derogatory remark about people of color, most of the white people would be uncomfortable, but they would think that the others weren't uncomfortable. And if we let them know that the discomfort was shared and we gave them things that they could do, including changing the subject, then most white people would intervene against the racially prejudicial remark. People do things that they think are required for social approval. And if the assumption is incorrect, people do things that they don't really want to do in order to get attention that most people don't want to give.
All right, Robbie Ludwig, what about that issue? If you're just joining us, you're listening to Mindset, Mental Health News and Information. I'm your host, James Curtis, along with psychologist, author, and I guess I would need a laundry list to name all the things you do, Robbie Ludwig, but among those are television expert, you help on shows, you're an authority, and you've done a lot of research in this area of sexual assault and campus sexual assault. What about that idea? Most men, arguably, based on what Alan Berkowitz, the expert that we're listening to right now, he's the author of a book called Responsibility, a complete guide to bystander intervention. It's a great book. You should pick it up. It's very thin, quick read, but very useful. What about that idea that most people in even these group situations that you were researching and were a part of investigating with the Nightline pieces, most of the young men or men there are not all in, if you would. They're not completely behind what's going on, but are doing it in I don't even know if it's right to call it peer pressure, but some sort of expectation that everybody else would look at me.
Well, that's a little bit like the group think, and right. I'm sure that's true for part of it. They want to prove their masculinity. They want to prove that they fit into this group. Because everybody's doing it, it doesn't seem like the crime that it is. There are some people who would even see it. There was one in one of the stories, and there have been so many recently. I don't remember exactly which college this happened in, but one of the frat boys saw it was going on and pretended to be asleep because he didn't want to get involved. And so, whether it's kind of, again, ignoring it and seeing it going on around you and not saying something, is that just as bad? It's an indication that there's a problem.
Well, certainly, but would you agree, and sorry to interrupt you on that point, but I just want to hover there for a moment. Would you agree with Alan Berkowitz that if these young people, and indeed there are stories and reports that you and I remember having been dealing with legal issues and psychological dynamics for years, back in the court TV days, of the notorious stories about women being assaulted and groups of full-grown adults, not college kids, just standing around. Is it a factor of these folks, whether they be young or old, simply not having the tools that they need to know how to intervene, even though they might want to?
Well, I think there could be fear, too. So I think that there's a component of that. There may be a fear component as well. What happens if I do get involved, or kind of a desensitization of empathy. This kind of notion of, that's their problem and I have to protect myself. So I think it can go either way, where someone either gets involved or someone, doesn't get involved at all. And where I do agree with the doctor is that, maybe some of these horrible situations happen because we don't know how to deal with them. And so what at least the college campuses have found is that when they have instituted an educational system describing what rape is, describing if you see something, say something, get involved, it has been tremendously successful in terms of reducing these incidents from happening.
Absolutely. And Alan Berkowitz talked about that. Before we get back into that portion of his interview, you're going to make another point, Robbie?
No. That was basically my point. That education and learning how to handle things really can help people make the right moves if, God forbid, they're in that situation.
And indeed, the project that Alan Berkowitz and others were involved in based on his research, and you can find him at alanberkowitz.com. All the studies are there, very well researched and tested and under the scientific method, talk about just such a program. It started in a workshop that he initiated and put together, and they expanded it to an online form. Here's a little bit of that. Right. Let's talk about the study. A couple of things jump out at me and really grab my attention. One, there were a lot of people, a lot of college kids involved in the study. And let's start at the beginning. And if you could give an overview of the study, how it was set up, and where it was located at the college campus, and how many students were participating.
First, we'll talk about the workshop, the original study, and that was implemented at Ohio University. The principal investigator is named Dr. Christine Giddich, who's one of the foremost researchers in the field, and she got a CDC grant, so all the taxpayers in the audience paid for this. She got a Centers for Disease Control grant to evaluate 2 workshops, a men's workshop to prevent sexual assault and a women's workshop what we call risk reduction to reduce women's risk of being sexually assaulted. Those were 2 workshops that were offered to first-year college students living in a residence hall. So let's say you and I live in residence hall A, and we would go to the men's workshop, but our friends live in residence hall B. They wouldn't get the workshop. They would get something else that was neutral. And the women in our residence hall would get the women's workshop, and the women in the other residence hall would get something neutral. So we evaluated the men's workshop by comparing it with a control group. The men in the workshop, which was approximately 650 men, received this program that I developed, which includes teaching men about consent, teaching men the truth about the other men. So we asked the men, would you respect a guy who intervened to prevent a sexual assault? And most guys would say yes, they would respect someone. But most guys thought that the other guys wouldn't respect them. So we did exercises in the workshop where they learned the good news about themselves. They learned most guys were good guys who wouldn't take advantage of women and who would respect guys who wouldn't take advantage of women. And then we also taught men role plays, how to intervene in various situations. If they saw a problem situation, what would they do? So that was like a workshop that took an hour and a half. And then we invited the men back for what we called a booster session after 4 months. And we also gave them post-surveys to see if there had been any change. And we found that a lot of good things happened. One is the men realized that most of the guys would be more likely to intervene. So they knew that the other men would also do something if they saw something. They changed so that they didn't reinforce what we call sexually aggressive behavior. What's really interesting is the men were less likely to associate with sexually aggressive men. So let's say you and I are living together in this residence hall, and I'm very sexually aggressive and I'm obnoxious towards women. The people who didn't get the workshop would hang out with me, but the people who got the workshop would realize we don't like Alan, and the other guys don't like him either, so we're not going to hang out with him. So, interestingly, the sexually aggressive men became marginalized as a result of the information we gave in the workshop, which is, let's say, very simplistically, that most men are good guys.
Wow.
So what we found is that after 4 months, 1.5% of those 600-odd men engaged in sexually aggressive behavior, as opposed to 7% in the group that didn't get the workshop. So that's a 75% decrease. So from a science point of view, that's a very strong effect to actually show that you reduce sexual assaults. But as I said, after 7 months, that went away, which I explained by saying that you can only expect a workshop for an hour and a half to last so long. What we're talking about here applies to other social problems as well.
And before we get into those other social problems, if you're just joining us, you're listening to Mindset, Mental Health News and Information. I'm your host, James Curtis, with my co-host and buddy, Dr. Robbie Ludwig. She is an author. She is a licensed psychotherapist. She does television consulting. She appears as an expert, and she is overall very, very cool. Robbie, what do you think about that idea that really sort of goes to your point of attacking the groupthink? That is giving the other individuals that may not be, and according to Alan Berkowitz's research, along with his team, Professor Gittich and the others that were involved there, have that reluctance, don't have the tools, but as you pointed out a moment ago, given those tools, then they can make some different choices. Does that ring true with you?
I think his research is really interesting. And, suggests how powerful instituting certain norms can be. So, it certainly says a lot, right? If
Absolutely.
you educate somebody and make an aggressive man not appealing and considered inappropriate, then, the good guy's sense of being good will come to the forefront. we all really impact one another.
Yeah.
And that could very easily get forgotten. And, perhaps there's something in these college campuses when they were looking the other way. The guys who were the bad guys, if you will, or the kind of aggressive or, inclined to rape for whatever reason, were not being punished.
Or challenged.
And just to flip it a bit, it's the kind of crime where people tend to question the victim.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of fear, understandably so. These are young kids, where you don't want to kind of basically malign somebody and say they're a rapist if it can't be proven, which a lot of cases it can't, because the people who are raped don't want to go in and have these tests. So just to backtrack a bit, that's where I think the responsibility, number one, of parents who are looking at colleges, they need to look at what is part of the college's way of addressing crimes on campus. How do they educate their teachers, their student bodies? How do they sanction some of these aggressive kids? How are they dealt with? These are all questions that really need to be asked, because that would hopefully underscore this notion of kids who are inclined to behave properly then will be allowed to behave properly because that's what's expected and that's what's acceptable, and anything else is not.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about the cops on the campus. Big schools and even small schools have law enforcement officers that are just assigned to the campus, but it goes beyond that, right, Robbie Ludwig? There are Title IX coordinators in all of these universities, and they're the ones that are charged with, and sometimes they break it up where the investigation is handled by a different arm before it even gets to the cops. But the education, the reporting, the initial investigation, and when you're talking about asking those types of questions, Robbie Ludwig, those are the people that should be approached, the folks in whether it be a student resource center or the dean's office that are in charge of the programming, the education, whether it be what Alan Berkowitz was talking about, and how do they go about investigating these types of issues? What are the resources and what are the statistics, no?
Well, yes, to all of that. I think the fact that we're even having these national conversations is important, because for a long time, these conversations weren't happening at all, and they needed to happen in order to address this. So I think since we know what's going on, everybody knows, hey, we all have a responsibility to reduce this from happening. Because if you have kids going in who you can't predict whether they would become rapists or not, and they end up in college and they're doing this and you can't predict it, and girls who are going to college are more inclined to be raped than not, we definitely have to have a national conversation of what's going wrong and how do we fix it.
Absolutely.
So that's the positive here, because these kinds of sexual crimes, you're right, they were very hard to kind of substantiate, because when a woman is raped, the last thing she wants to do is be touched anywhere.
Yeah.
And it just feels, she's in a traumatized state. And, in order to get the proper evidence, you'd have to go to the police, get a rape kit, and it feels very invasive. And not only that, the woman is often questioned, like, are you really telling the truth?
Right.
Did this really happen? And because of the way traumatic events get remembered, it's not like this timeline. Well, at 9 o'clock, I went to the dorm party, and then at 9:15, so-and-so gave me a drink and then locked me in a room. It doesn't happen in that time frame. In fact, time can jump all over the place, and in some cases, sights and sounds get remembered more vividly than anything else. So even in the repeating of the story, it may not sound logical and may raise doubt. So it's one of those bizarre crimes when women are looked at in a suspicious way.
Yes.
Not to say it can't happen to men too, but it tends to be more women in these college scenarios. So, women are often looked at as, well, why'd you get yourself in that situation? Why'd you get so drunk that you couldn't say no? What were you wearing? Were you one of the bad girls? And for a long time, the onus was put on the woman to not put herself in a position where she wouldn't be treated like a lady. Not understanding this is a crime. It doesn't matter if a woman walks around naked and is talking about how many beers she could guzzle. The bottom line is, you don't have permission to have sex with her if she tells you no, or if she's not in a position to tell you yes. And one lawyer said, hey, maybe we need to get to a point where a woman signs a consent form. I'm agreeing to have sex. Now, I'm sure there would be ways to challenge that as well.
Yeah.
But do we really want to get to that point?
Right. And I want to hover on the victim side of this because we're talking about dealing with the perpetrators. However, part of the program that Alan Berkowitz talked about, and again, if you're just joining us, you're listening to Mindset, Mental Health News and Information. I'm your host, James Curtis. I'm talking with my good buddy and co-host, licensed psychotherapist, psychologist, author, television commentator, expert consultant, and a whole bunch more, Dr. Robbie Ludwig out of New York. I want to hover on that point, and I want to mention that Alan Berkowitz, the expert on bystander intervention, talks about in this effort, in his study and in the extension of that study in the context of the colleges where they did the experiment, which was very successful, there is a female component about how to stay safe. Where is the line? And we've only got about a minute left. And for those of you who want to hear the rest of my interview with Alan Berkowitz, again, his website, all of his information on our Facebook page, facebook.com/mindset show page. Where is the line, Dr. Robbie Ludwig, with respect to blaming a woman and empowering a woman to be as strong and as capable to ensure her own safety? Because, guys, we blow it all the time when we want to talk about this.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I think the key is use your judgment, assess other people's character, understand human nature to some extent, and try to put yourself in scenarios that feel safe, have a backup plan, try to be amongst people who you can trust. If something has, some place on campus has a bad reputation for being wild and treating women badly, maybe that's a place to avoid. Try to protect yourself as much as you can. Maybe you figure out how to make sure that you bring your own drinks or you don't drink at all, so that you have your wits about you. Try to think in a more, from a more offensive, what is it? No, it's not offensive. You want to think more protectively.
Proactively.
Yes, more proactively. And, if you're in that state of mind, I think, people can sometimes go after the most vulnerable or the weakest link because it's the path of least resistance.
Sure.
They're not going to go after the person that's just harder to get. Now, that's not to say the person who gets raped deserves it in any way or didn't protect herself in the right kind of way.
Certainly.
I'm not saying that at all. But if we're going to look at, how do we protect our women out there, let them know this is happening. Have peers come and do talks so that they can hear it not only from a parent's voice. Sometimes when I tell my kids something, they look at me like I have 5 heads and they don't want to hear what I have to say. At least that's what they say, because I'm from a different generation.
Right.
And I remember when my mother would get anxious and over the top at the time, it was concern about AIDS. And
Sure.
I would think she was crazy. What are you talking about? Don't be so anxious. But kids can hear things from other kids.
Exactly. And what you're talking about, and we're going to have to leave it right there, Dr. Robbie Ludwig. Unfortunately, only got a few seconds, so let me just wrap this up. And if you want to stay or hang around, Robbie Ludwig, and talk about this some more, we'll do that on the other side of this break, which I have to take. The rest will be on the podcast. The predatory nature of predators is to pick on the perceived weakest link, though, Robbie Ludwig, and I think that that's certainly understandable. You're listening to Mindset, mental health news and information. We're going to cut it here. We're going to continue this conversation with Alan Berkowitz, expert on bystander intervention. Robbie Ludwig, my name is James Curtis. Stay with us on the other side.